Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's National Arts Club program. My name is Catherine Klaschewski. For those of you who are not familiar with the National Arts Club, we are a 501c3 nonprofit based in New York City with the mission to stimulate, foster, and promote public interest in the arts and to educate the American people in the fine arts. Annually, the club offers more than 150 free programs to the public, including exhibitions, theatrical and musical performances, lectures, and readings. For more information about the National Arts Club, you can visit us at nationalartsclub.org or find us on Facebook, Instagram, X, and YouTube. Following the conversation will be a brief Q&A, so please feel free to use the chat or Q&A function for any questions you might have. Today's program is Wigging Out, Fake Hair That Made Real History, and our guest is the author, Jessica Glasscock. Let me tell you about her. Jessica Glasscock is a writer, researcher, and college instructor. She is the author of Striptease, From Gaslight to Spotlight, American Fashion Accessories, Making a Spectacle, and her most recent book, Wigging Out, Fake Hair That Made Real History. She also worked as a researcher and education liaison for the Costume Institute at the Metropolitan Museum of Art for over a decade before joining New York Historical Society and Library. An instructor at Parsons School of Design since 2003, and sometimes a consulting fashion historian for V-Files Digital Archive, Jessica is primarily devoted to becoming a professional bon vivant. While she loves to write and teach, she hopes to be remembered for being clever at dinner. Please welcome Jessica Glasscock. Hi, Jessica.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me. This is really fun. I can't wait to tell everybody about the history of the wig, a most joyful accessory. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we'll get into it. All right. One moment. I'm having a bit of technical difficulty. Let me just try this again. Ah, there she is, Alana Nazimova, who's our hero image for this story. But we may circle back to her and this wig she is wearing and why. I really want to take you through the full history of the wig, which takes us from Egypt to Instagram, as I like to say. So let's get into it and begin at the beginning, which is in ancient Egypt. You know, I had such an amazing time getting into a fashion history that is more than just Paris, New York, and London, and thinking about this particular accessory and how it relates to sort of the practices of not just fashion, but wellness and even spiritual support, which is definitely part of the wig story. And that story, as I said, starts in Egypt. I've got a couple of lovely artifacts from the Metropolitan Museum of Art's collection that show figures wearing wigs, the earliest wigs. We have here a statuette of the Lady Tai wearing an incredible wig, also an amazing bejeweled necklace. And we also have a figure wearing what was called the Nubian wig in ancient Egyptian times. It's actually the lid of a canopic jar from a tomb. The canopic jars were used to contain the viscera that accompanied the mummification and traveled, you know, supported this travel to the afterlife. And so they're sort of depicting figures as they would have been in life. And I love these two because They're both so beautiful. They're such beautiful women, but also because they really crisply capture this use of these abundant braids in the Egyptian wig, which is where our story starts. So this is a rendering in contemporary hair of what an Egyptian wig could have looked like. This is from the wig rings that you see. The hair is sort of all encapsulated in this beautiful set of rings were actually discovered in a tomb. The wig itself had rotted away. And so what they did in the museum was take a sort of figure from the same period and tried to recreate the hair and the wig that all of these rings would have gone on, and did a beautiful job, I think. You know, one thing we notice here is that everything, all of the hair is coming from the top of the wig, and we'll get into why that's excellent and important wig technique a little bit later. Uh, but I also was able to find in the collection at the Metropolitan Museum of Art a actual Egyptian wig, which was really important to include in my book, and I also think is really beautiful, especially as it's shown here, which is a dressing that was created at the Met in the 1970s. And I think I was so attracted to it because to me it was so fashion, right? I mean, this is a very, you know, you could see this figure sort of in a fashion editorial, even though the wig itself is, as you see, from around 1040 BC. So it's a very ancient wig. It was found under the head of the mummy, the Princess Nani. And so this is the wig that she was taking to the afterlife. And that's why it has been unearthed and now lives at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. You can see that there are braids and that there is almost this sort of a hunkiness, a heaviness to the braids, which has a lot to do with how wigs were styled and made in ancient Egypt. They would treat the hair, which could be natural hair, the best, the royal, the religious wigs would typically be made of natural hair, but could also be made of linen, flax, other plant material. But the natural hair would be treated with wax, animal fat, things to basically sort of style it and secure it, like secure the style as well. And this is indeed treated with beeswax, which is why you have this sort of solidity to it. I've positioned it next to an image of the Princess Nami from her Book of the Dead. And I really love this juxtaposition because you can sort of see the reality of the wig, admittedly, 3,000 years later. So it may, you know, it's probably taken some wear in that time, but the reality of the wig and with the artistic depiction of a wig in Egyptian art, which is much more stylized and sort of, you know, precise, whereas the real wig does sort of evoke natural hair a little more to a degree. That wasn't necessarily the goal of the Egyptian wig, though. It was supposed to be stylized. It was supposed to be a wig that looked like a wig. And that's not always true in the history of the wig. You have wigs that are meant to be hidden. There's a period where, you know, wig is referred to as a transformation. They don't even want to call it a wig. But that was not the case in ancient Egypt. That's because wigs were luxury objects. They were expressive of status. Indeed, they were expressive of even the idea that you had the leisure to devote yourself to beauty. That was a form of wealth in this world. It was very deeply connected to court life, deeply connected to religious life, but it also sort of came down to simply people who were wealthy enough to participate in various ways. It was also worn by men and women, which in periods of the wig's popularity isn't always the case. There are periods where wigs are more popular for men, periods where they're solely for women, and men would want to really hide any use of a wig or a toupee, not get caught at it, if you will, and so forth, but not the case in ancient Egypt. So here we see Uni and his wife Renenutet, pardon me, I hope it didn't mangle that, Uni and Renan Nuet, who are illustrated here, a portrait really of them as a couple, and they are both wearing wigs, but you can see that they are different wigs. So there were sort of masculine and feminine aspects to the wigs that were worn. Some wigs were more feminine, some were more masculine, and that was a divide, as you would also see a divide with the dress as well. I wanted to show this in particular both because I love this particular work. I believe you can walk and visit it at the Met even now. I believe it is currently installed in the Egyptian galleries, but also because when you get close to it, you can see the real detail, the fineness of how the braids that are part of the wig are rendered. The artist who created this work obviously spent an enormous amount of time trying to specifically and concisely capture what this wig looked like. And that's also how we know it was really important and a crucial part of, what you wanted to sort of put forward about yourself in a portrait. This is also a great wig because it is quite substantial, as you see. I would imagine it had, some weight, but I wanted to use this to talk about how this Egyptian wig was made. So there's an Egyptian wig in the collection of the British Museum, which is from approximately the same period, within a couple of decades. And they have a wig that they have analyzed in detail to sort of assess how it is made. So first thing, it is made of hundreds of individual braids. But then they also looked a little deeper and found that those individual braids were each composed of 400 strands of human hair. So you have hundreds of braids, each made of 400 strands of human hair, and then it is all attached to a net sort of covering that's meant to be the head covering that's also made of human hair. The way that they would affix the braids to the net would be to take the braid and sort of loop it over the net and then use some kind of pomade, fixative, likely animal fat, to secure the braid. So they're like looping each individual braid of these hundreds into the net, and then it is sort of completed, styled, and can be worn on the head. Because there was no interest in it not looking like a wig, one thing that they didn't worry about with many Egyptian wigs was the hairline. As a matter of fact, you would probably want sort of a defined hairline again, as they said in Vogue in the 1960s, make sure that everyone knows you are wearing a wig. That's very much the aesthetic at this time. It's also, you can see she's sort of wearing sort of a crown element on top, and that would help to sort of secure and weight the wig as well. So it is very much an incredible look that really, gives us a sense of how valued wigs were in the Egyptian world. And the way that it was made is still very much related to how wigs continue to be made and developed. In research in the Egyptian tombs, they have found wig blocks, which is to say the head on which a wig would be sort of shaped and formed. They have found obviously all of these beads and elements that would have gone in the wig. They have found patterns for wig making. This was work that was done. And in fact, hairdressers and wig makers are depicted in tomb art as well. So this was a really key element to court life, especially as we know it, and shows you the centrality of this. And Egypt, of course, is the foundation of a lot of beauty practice that is ongoing. Eyeliner, lipstick, all of these things sort of existed, and elements were found in the tomb. Another thing to note about this is that this is one wig, but there would have been multiple styles and different wigs for different occasions in Egypt as well. And there would have been additions. Another thing that's been found in the tombs was a basket full of, well, they were additional braids, but I think you can even speak of them as extensions. A lot of them were made with human hair in black, but there's also evidence of braids that were dyed indigo or henna for stronger color. So we know that there's these abundant, and very developed ideas of the wig that already exist in ancient Egypt. And that's where it comes from, right? Now, when we get into the history of more wig making in the 18th century, we will find that this history is forgotten. But in the 20th century, the connection with Egypt and the wig will be revived as the wig emerges and is marketed yet again. One more image that can help us transition from the wig world of Egypt to what comes next. This is mummy mask, but it is interesting and useful to sort of illustrate the wig here for a couple of reasons. One is you really have this great illustration of a plant-based material being used as the wig on the mummy mask, but we know these plant-based materials were also used in wigs. So I felt like this was as close as I could get, besides the incredible Princess Nani wig, to like a look of what it really looks like. But this is also a fascinating piece because the mask is made sort of realistically, which was very much the style of the Romans at this time. And now we're in a period where there's a lot of interaction between Egypt and Rome, and where in a lot of senses, Egypt is on the decline. It's so funny when you look at the history of wigs and writing about it, and they talk about in the time of Cleopatra and Cleopatra's wigs. Well, really, Cleopatra, when she was in Rome, didn't wear a wig because it wasn't popular there. When she wore a wig, it was in Egypt and to represent herself as an Egyptian queen. When she was in Rome, she went without the wig as a sort of Roman beauty. And this particular mummy mask sort of represents the overlap of these two cultures. But from Egypt, we go to Rome, which is where the next part of the wig story takes place. And in my book, when I talked about Rome and the hair practice there, and then into Italy, really into the 15th century, I called the chapter Dangerous Blondes. This references the interest of the Romans specifically in blonde hair when they do, engage with the wig, which is definitely not as much as Egypt, but they were very interested in blonde hair. But I also call it dangerous blondes because of where that hair was coming from, which was from the Gauls and the Franks, who the Romans were in the midst of conquering. The Gauls in particular really valued their hair, Gaul warriors. They grew their hair long. It was a point of pride. And when Julius Caesar defeated the Gauls, he demanded that the Gauls cut their hair in tribute to him. And then there were many who were brought back to Rome as slaves. And so some of that blonde hair that went into the wigs of Roman matrons, very wealthy Roman matrons, was taken from those people, sometimes from those people who worked in the houses and were slaves in the houses. And so that's why I fashioned it this way. They are dangerous blondes, and they're doing a very different thing with the wigs and how they're made, because they're sort of assembling these hair pieces from various sources. This is a sort of portrait head, but it captures two key aspects of the Roman hairstyle that could, in some cases, probably did, but didn't always necessarily. With a wig, sometimes only your hairdresser knows for sure. But that is the case with this hairstyle. You see from the front view, you have all of these tight curls in the front piece. The way those would have been made in Roman hairstyling would have been to take sort of tubes, metal tubes that had a heat source inserted inside of them, and then the hair was wrapped around it to create these sort of tight heated curls. As you can imagine, that was a little bit dangerous to do to next to one's scalp. And so one aspect of hair pieces, particularly in this period, the first century AD in Rome, was that the value of the wig was that it could be pre-made for you. You could have all of that styling work done on a hairpiece that would simply go in the front with the hair really braided in the back, as you see in the back view from this same piece. Or if one was losing one's hair and didn't have this abundant hair in the back, you could reverse it and sort of pull all the curls and form the curls in the front, and then use a hairpiece as a long braid to cover the hair loss in the back. But in Rome, as in Egypt, this moment of the wig in Rome, it was very much about also status. That this was a very expensive thing, a very dearly got, this false hair. And so that's why it was worn by these women of power who were related to power to sort of express that power. I will tell you there's been a little bit of conflict in the sort of history of Roman hair, because some argue that wigs were more heavily used than others. There's actually a sort of fashion costumer historian who's been able to reproduce a lot of Roman hairstyles with natural hair, but it does require natural hair that is all the way down to one's tailbone. That's how much hair you need, and not everybody has that much hair all the time. But there's also tells that you can see, and this was a really fun part of researching the book for me. It became wig spotting. And once you start wig spotting, you can't undo it. Like I'm useless for certain movies now because I'm like, oh, that's a wig. Like I can tell. Wig spotting, especially, where does the hair hit the forehead? And as you can see here, like a little too low. Like that's a bit of a tell. Also, if you look at sort of the bottom and the side view, you're seeing like this sort of baby hair underneath, but it's really this front piece that suggests that this certainly is a hairpiece and a wig that would be worn by this woman, by Marciana, sister of the emperor. Um, I'm sure the question in your minds is, did men wear wigs in this period? And the answer is mostly no, and you certainly wouldn't want anyone to know about it. The loss of hair was considered a little bit emasculating in ancient Rome, and Julius Caesar created his amazing haircut in part to hide his receding hairline. Two of the emperors that we know wore wigs, or rather, I would say toupees, were Otho and Hadrian. And the wigs that they wore were very much intended to look natural, to not be discovered. So, really, wig wearing in this period was by women. I'm going to jump ahead in this story, but I'm jumping ahead in part because wigs went out of fashion really hard after the fall of Rome. I think in great part because the decadence and ugliness with which they were associated were really rejected as this a society that was dominated by Christianity emerged. And so you really had a rejection of the wig. There's a lot of incredible writing about how terrible and awful wigs are by people who are sort of affiliated with the church. It's heavily rejected really for hundreds of years. And then also there's a period where women's hair is very much covered, certainly on top, if not all around. So it just doesn't come up. Wigs would only come up really up until the 15th century if you had a serious hair loss. And that's how wigs sort of get preserved in fashion history. There's always people who may have a need due to hair loss for wigs. And then there's also the history of sort of theatrical wig making to capture other time periods. So that's another place where wigs live even when they're not popular as well. But really, they were, let's say, underground. Keep it under your hat, if you will, for a while. In the 15th century, you start to see the reemergence of both this affinity for blonde hair and the use of augmented hair. Really, we're going to call it extensions in a lot of ways. And this image by Botticelli is a great example of what you would start to see in Italian Renaissance hair. You can look at this, and if you look closely, you see that there are these wonderful braided elements. You also see that there's fabric interleaved into the braid and the hairstyle, and a lot of jewelry it brought in as well, but it's so substantial that you have like this sort of hank of hair trapped in the fabric at the back, and then these braids that come all the way down the body and down the bodice of this dress. Now, is this real hair? And by real hair, I mean, did anybody really wear their hair this way? And the question is, probably not. It's a little bit of a fantasy hairstyle. Uh, does it reflect? Let's call it aspirational. I'm going to go with aspirational. This is an aspirational hairstyle, but it also reflects the very real practices of sort of interweaving extensions, applying these things with sort of, again, like a gum pomade. You can think of it very similarly to the adhesive that one would use with extensions now. And also, we're using materials that are not hair to sort of create color and interest and liveliness in the hairstyle, this fantasy hairstyle that we see on the Botticelli figure. And we also have actual wigs. This is a idealized portrait of a young woman as Flora, and we believe also a courtesan who is wearing a blonde wig that reflects the ongoing popularity of blonde hair in Italy. In Rome, initially wigs were associated and indeed required for prostitutes to wear. So that's part of the incoming of blonde hair. Here we see a courtesan also wearing this blonde wig and connecting with this classical tradition. This, from the Italian sort of Renaissance community, I don't know, the community, the Medicis, the bankers, the wealthy people of this community start to bring wigs back into the forefront and are creating incredible art that sort of displays the value of them and the beauty of them. And that's how we start to see wigs rise again. And rise they do, especially in the royal courts of Europe. So we have two great figures in the history of wigs, one lesser known than the other. Henry III was famed for wig wear and was one of the few kings coming into the 16th century who was. The way that court hair worked, both for men and for women, is that people who were part of the court wore their hair like the king. That was the idea. You identified you were a courtier, you sported that look. And many kings were not interested in wig wearing really up until Henry III. The reason Henry III supposedly wore a wig is that he had had a bit of an over-dyeing accident, and he had dyed his hair to a degree that it was falling out. And so what his solution was, and it's very elegantly portrayed here, is that he attached hair to the fringes of the cap that he wore and created this hairstyle, which then his courtiers also modeled and wore. But we'll get to more boys later. The real figure, the icon, the true queen of wig wear is, of course, Elizabeth I. And here we see a miniature of Elizabeth I in a period when she was definitely wearing a wig. She was about age 54 with this image. And so we know from her history that she'd had issues with her hair falling out, but also that she understood the sort of dramatic power of a strong wig, that it sort of cut an incredible figure, that it created sort of literal size and presence. That's what it was about. And I love this image, even though it's a miniature, because there's so much presence in it. You have the wig itself, you have all of the jewels, you have this sort of lace element there in the back that's supported almost crown-like. Then you have this incredible lace collar, and then pearls and more jewels and like a really big sleeve. And everything about this says wealth and power. And that was part of what the wig became a message of in the courts of Europe. And because with king, as with queen, the courtiers start to wear these wigs as well because they want to sort of identify and reflect the glory of the queen. And then also you have a lot of documentation such as prints, miniatures, copied paintings that start to circulate this fashion to people outside of the court and make it more widespread. So we see some examples of that here. Ellen Morris in 1597, who may not be wearing a wig. She wouldn't necessarily have to wear a wig. She is modeling her hair after Queen Elizabeth, but certainly, even if you weren't wearing a wig, the idea was that you might want the hair to look like a wig. So dyeing the hair red or dyeing the hair blonde would have been typical in that court and kind of gave the hair the look of the wig, even if it wasn't a wig. Now, this 1600 portrait of a woman is definitely a wig. And you know that because you can see through to the scalp there, and that's been portrayed by the artist, which I just love. But both of these paintings are modeled after a painting of Queen Elizabeth. So this all sort of reflects her impact on the court, and specifically the style of her wig, which was a tightly curled auburn wig. That was sort of her, that was her hallmark. Unlike, say, Mary Queen of Scots, who preferred like sort of a horn shape that brought the hair up around her eyes. Everyone had to have their own thing, as you can imagine. Another image from the court, 1606, and I love this because this girl is old in this portrait, which is lovely and amazing to me. And so you see she's got this really bouffant hairstyle, likely natural hair, but it needs elements to happen. When I started writing the story of the wig, I realized, you know, that there was more to the wig than the wig, that extensions, that insertions, wool pads, toe, like all of the elements that create like a really grand hairstyle have elements of false hair or, you know, human hair made into hair pieces in them. And I think this is a great example of that, because if you look at the jewelry in her hairstyle, it's just stuck in there like it's a pin cushion. And that means that there is something inside supporting this. Could be wool, could be silk padding, could be hair that her natural hair is strung over. A few more royal women and their royal hair. This is Catherine de Bourbon, and also she had her very specific style. Looking at the hairline is one of the tells that this is a wig. Even better is Marie de Medici, who here with her wig has a little curl going on all along the front. That's an excellent way to hide the hairline. Which is one of the tells. It's a way to hide that tell. You want to hide the parting and hide the hairline. Those are the places where people can identify the wig. Marie de Medici was particularly famous for her blonde wig. That was her look that she cultivated, and she actually kept a number of blonde young male pages at her court and had them grow their hair so that she could use it in her wigs. Our last royal has to be Maria Theresa, the Infanta of Spain. And I love this because this is another very young girl, but still wearing elements of a wig, elements of false hair, and really capturing what all of these are, which is like spectacular event hair. This is a portrait that was made of her when she was being circulated for marriage. And so this would have been sent to all the courts of Europe and wanted to really capture you know, the wealth and beauty of this creature of the court of Spain. And she ended up, of course, marrying Louis XIV. This is a great example of, you know, the sort of false hair intermixed with supporting structure, because there's a wire frame that she had to wear, and then false hair and real hair was interwoven into it to create this sort of expansive, almost pannier style haircut to again cut this figure. It was a, you know, PR. This is PR hair, red carpet hair, if you will. So by the century, you start to see the wig more popularized, but really specifically for men. Reasoning behind this, well, certainly the influence of royal hair. Also, the idea that this hair was easier to manage and maintain. We have a great account of the diarist Samuel Pepys, who talks about having his wig made, I believe around 1663. And what he did was he went to the barber and had his own hair cut completely off. And then the barber took that hair to make him a wig. That's why I start with this guy from 1762, not just because dashing, very, very dashing preacher from the Rijksmuseum, but also because but the hair matches his eyebrows. And so that to me suggests that this is likely a wig that was made from his own hair, and that he is now wearing for this incredible portrait. I also love that the wig looks so beautiful and resplendent and glossy and golden. And that's because once you had a wig and you wanted, clean hair, which was a special, rare, wealthy thing in the 17th century, you just took it to your barber and he would take the hair and he would wash the hair and he would style the hair. And then you come back and you've got beautiful hair for your portrait. So that was a large advantage to the wigs for men in this period. So it's still a big part of royal hair. And I think, you start to get it really peaking in popularity when Charles II adopted the wig. His hair was going a little gray. So he decided to embrace the wig. And this is a wonderful piece of raised work embroidery that's based on a painting of Charles II. Pardon me. And I love this weird, gross little hairball that they put in there, just because it's just like, yeah, this was like crucial to his look. Like this was a huge part of who he was, who he presented to the public. So you have this sort of doll size, and this is inches tall version of Charles II that really shows the big hair, the full bottomed wig, as historians later termed it, and its popularity in this moment. When people are having things like full statuary busts made of themselves in their wig, the wig is really important and expensive. There were even stories of wig thieves in this period where they would have a child hide inside a basket and snatch the wigs off of people's heads. I'm not sure that happened that often, but it's an amazing story and I support it. And this is the gentleman who would wear the wig. And again, the hairline's all wrong. But that's okay, because you want people to know it's a wig as much as you want people to know about the fine lace that you're wearing. And you're really looking at price points in the same range for both of these accessories. This is one of the best wigs in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I'm going to say it. I'm going to put it out there. Stand by it. And was worn by a Russian figure of the court of Peter the Great. And it also captures something that I love in portraits of men in wigs in the 17th and early 18th century, which is the combination of like full wig and your armor. This also tells, like, this is like a macho kind of thing to have this full head of hair. It has to do with status. It has to do with, wealth. I mean, as many, more than one head of hair could go into making a really fine wig, but it's also like this bigger than life presentation of a sort of warrior figure. And you actually see it in a lot of the portraits that include wigs, the element of armor, maybe even a sword, possibly a map that shows something you're about to conquer. Like that's the big wig look of this period. Another example, Eugene, Prince of Savoy, there pointing to, I think, probably France, which he's about to go kick their ass. Pardon me. In 1718, he actually emerged from the court of Louis XIV, but Louis XIV wouldn't give him a commission for the army. So he went to Austria and joined the Habsburgs and then fought France from there, and mastered this incredible wig, which you see, pardon me, at this point is powdered, which becomes the style as you come into the 18th century, and full armor, sword, etc. He's big, he's bad, he's going to invade France. So there's an evolution, as you would imagine, in wigs as we come from the 17th century into the 18th century. And I think it's really beautifully illustrated by this particular image where you see the wig of 1714 contrasted with the wig of 1726, but it's the wig of 1714 on an aristocrat and his footmen, and then the wig of 1726, pardon me, on an aristocrat and his footmen. And look how they have the same wig now. The 18th century is when the wig starts to change in shape, but also become much more widespread and democratized to a degree in the 18th century. And you know that big wig thing was tired. The full bottom thing was over. This particular gentleman is staring down that old full bottomed wig and saying, no, this is much, much better. Again, armor with the wig. Also notice all the wig powder that he's gotten on his shoulders there, which has to, I mean, that's a choice that he and the artist made. I have to think that it sort of reflects kind of a flex of wig wearing in this moment. The armor, by the way, was from the artist, not his own. And as you can imagine, this period of the 18th century of like abundant wigs is a boon for men who have lost their hair, as this gentleman has. You can see very clearly the crisp line of the wig and that there is not hair underneath, although it would have been more typical to blend natural hair into the wig for men in the later 18th century. There's a figure that I think we won't spend too much time on, but the most controversial and ostentatious male wig wearers of the 18th century were, of course, the macaronis. And Richard Cosway, here in a self-portrait, was a macaroni, part of this club of Englishmen who'd visited Italy and then returned to England and ate macaroni and and were dandies, essentially. And you can see he's got this wig that is sort of built up very high and substantial. Not as high and substantial as it is illustrated here in this satirical print that very much exaggerates the wig. And this is maybe a little bit the last gasp of the wig for men, as we will see. In the meantime, you have this tremendous business and all sorts of wigs. It's very difficult to kind of map men's wigs in the 18th century because every time they create a new wig, it's not like the old wig went away. So they're just so abundant in style. This is a example of, I would say, a very cheap wig, probably an ill-made, not a high-style wig at all, but an example of a late 18th century wig that could have been worn by a footman or even as a theatrical costume. But it gives you some sense of sort of what it looks like in real life. We don't have a lot of that because when wigs went out of fashion for men, a lot of them ended up being turned into sort of dust mops. And this thing that had been so expensive became very sort of cheap garbage when it went out of fashion. The 18th century is also an incredible time in hair for women, although not so much wigs as extensions and added elements. The style, the desired style, the ideal style of the 18th century for women was to wear your natural hair. At the same time, when you look at this admittedly exaggerated satirical print, you can imagine that there's no way anybody's natural hair is going to do some of the tricks that it has to do in the 18th century. So we will bounce through that quickly. So you have this idea of this sort of inserted padded piece that goes under the huge bouffant style. You have the sort of emergence of the high style hairstylist who's promoting things that have extra braids, extra curls. You have all of these wonderful elements that are illustrated and articulated in Diderot's encyclopedia: inserts, extensions, frizzes and frills, the way the wig is made. And you have the sort of satirical idea of women's hair in the 18th century. Here, which wasn't so far off. This is the La Belle Poulet style, where you wear an entire ship on your head. So that's a real style that actually happened. This is a satirical style, but they're getting close. So by the end of the 18th century, there's a real rejection of the wig. and these sort of decadent ideas that it's attached to. But what we find is that the wig never really goes away. In the early 19th century, you have a short hairstyle called ala titus, and it's so short that you want to mix it up for the evening. So wigs are good for that. You also have a lot of extensions like braids, curls that can be appended on to high style hair. And those are now being sold mass marketed. So this is an example of a number of braids that you could buy or go to your hairdresser and have done. Examples from fashion plates of all the different hair pieces that you could append to your hairstyle in 1865, 1875, and then we come to the 20th century. And I know I'm going into like, I promised I wasn't going to talk too long about the 18th century, but then I did. By the 20th century, you start to see a revival and really the introduction of the high fashion wig as we now know it, which came in first in 1914 with these color wigs. Here, you see this very blue wig, Nile green, carrot red, blue wigs come into fashion briefly in the 19 teens. You also have at the same time wigs that echo the chemically treated hairstyles that are popular in the 20s and 30s as well as the fancy dress hairstyles. This an example of a fancy dress party. She's dressed as Diana the Huntress in a tinsel wig. And this is Antoine, 30s hairstylist and wig maker, who would have made that kind of thing. Finally, in the 60s, you have the real wig out, which starts with Givenchy putting his models into wigs by Rosita and Maria Carita, whose wig salon creates the bubble wig, which is the first hit of what will be many in the 1960s. We also have the introduction of Dynel, the plastic, essentially, material that makes wigs incredibly inexpensive, accessible, more functional, maybe a little hotter, like temperature wise, but otherwise amazing. And you have the sort of expansion of the wig market. It's embraced not just by Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, but Ebony and Jet are also sort of introducing all of these new wigs in the 1960s. It becomes a really important part of Black hair alongside the natural Black hair, which is emerging at this time as well. They both sort of live concurrently as a whole editorial with Cicely Tyson in Ebony showed in the 1960s. And then you have the icons of wig wear in this period. We cannot not talk about Diana Ross and the Supremes and their many, many boxes of wigs that they traveled with. And then you have the emergence of the high style hairdressers who are now credited in Vogue and who are now making their own wigs and being a part of this boom in the 70s, which actually kind of crashes in 1971. But in that decade, it went from $50 million a year of hair sales into $500 million a year of hair sales. All of this comes to the runway and gives us high fashion hair as we now know it and see it in fashion. And you can see that extensions are a huge part of this, add-ons are a huge part of this, but it's all about creating this incredible fantasy that reaches back to the whole history of hair, from the Egyptian to the 18th century to the sort of fantasy element, and then to the 1920s bob as well. It's like we have sort of hair and wigs now, then, and forever. And that's the end. Thank you. Questions?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I did the 20th century really fast. I apologize.
You did. No, don't apologize. Oh my gosh. So, well, as you can see, my hair has grown since.
Thank you.
Thank
So we
you.
party now.
Yeah. Actually, I don't know if you want to take down your slide for a quick second. So I wanted to show them the book that you've written, Wigging Out. fake hair that made real history. I have a question. What actually, how did you choose the cover? I mean, that must have been so difficult.
Well, for me, on this topic and thinking about wigs and like my personal experience, it's so connected to club kids and drag and nightlife. Like that is a real like that's my point of entry. And Suzanne Barsh, who is wearing a wig made by Francis Rodriguez, who's featured on the cover, is, I mean, she's been queen of the night for like 30 years. And she's doing in that particular image a sort of cotton candy 18th century look that's very fake hair, but also like there's so much embedded in that image. And it's pink, which I like. I mean, I think, I thought it was a great image. In the book, I interviewed a number of professionals in the field. I interviewed a braider, I interviewed a photographer who sort of specializes in drag performers. I interviewed a couple of different wig makers, and one of them was Francis Rodriguez, who did he does Suzanne Barsh's hair. Like that's part of his practice. And so we talked about it, and I loved her. And I found that image, and I was like, please, please, please let me use this. And he said yes, and the photographer said yes, and Suzanne said yes. Like everybody said yes, and that was really lucky. I think it's such an amazing image. I think she's such an amazing person.
Yeah, actually in your book you actually have three interviews. One with Nicholas Needham, who is a portraitist,
Yes.
and Brianna Spruill. Am I pronouncing her name correctly?
Sproul. Yes.
She's the braider, and then Isaac Davidson. He's a wig maker, and I was reading actually, particularly with Isaac, that actually during COVID he was actually more busy than ever before. I thought that was really interesting. Why do you think that was? That people.
I think, well, I think number one, he had a lot to do with sort of like people were at home and maybe had these wigs and wanted to like, it's sort of this moment of like, well, what's going on here? What do I have here? And he really, what I love about Isaac, because he's been in this since like the first wave of extensions, like the Paris Hilton, and he really moves with whatever is happening. And so I think he immediately saw that he could help people like kind of refresh and revitalize their wigs, or kind of take up this fantasy when everybody was in this place that wasn't about fantasy. And he wanted to do that. I mean, he loves what he does, and he's been at it for a while, and he's always doing new things. He told me that one of the other things he did over that time was he took a Photoshop class to find out how like wigs can be retouched, so he could make sure that his wigs wouldn't need to be retouched. Like that he wanted to sort of like increase the editorial reality. That was one of the things that he did. But also I think, from him I really learned like how widespread the more spectacular wigs are. I mean, there's a lot of reasons to wear wigs. I'm very much connecting with ones that are for fashion or ones that are for event and party, all of that. I think like he connects with that, but he's got all the reasons, to sort of work with it. And he told me how much regular people do want like a full look, if you will, or three. And they're wearing, he was like, and they're wearing it to Disneyland. I'm like, great, let's
And
do
look,
it.
yeah, and let's not forget, people want to disguise themselves if they want to go out. Like celebrities, they tend to wear wigs and they'll put sunglasses on and they'll go out without being seen, and maybe even spies, perhaps. I don't know. So
Yeah.
I think we better get to the questions here.
Okay.
So the first question is, what were the early wigs made out of? I think you did cover this, but can you just
So it depends on what we mean by early. Egyptian wigs, human hair, but also linen, flax, plant materials. When you get to the 17th century, a real boom time, you're seeing human hair, but also horse hair, goat hair. There was actually a lot of anxiety about plague hair in the 17th century. When Samuel Pepys went to get his second wig made, he was worried that the wig maker might use the hair of people who had died of the plague in the wig. That was a big anxiety. That's a perpetual anxiety. Like, where is the hair coming from? I think, people, like, it's a sticky thing, and it's an issue. When you get to the 18th century, there's an established system that's even more established by the time you get to the 19th century of French wig makers sending people to Brittany, in France specifically, and paying very little for women there to sell the back of their hair, because their traditional headdress like covered the back of their hair. So they would go there and buy the hair, and the women would sell them the hair and just put their hat on, so they weren't really sort of losing a look. And then they would take that hair back to Paris to be worked into all of the various, waterfalls and rats and mice. Hair pieces in the 19th century have great names. But so that was a lot of where that came from. When you get to the 1960s, Dynel, plastic, mode acrylic, essentially, is where hair's coming from. But also you start to see the hair coming from India, where it comes from specific religious temples where people were already going to dedicate their hair. And that hair becomes a big part of the wig market, especially in the 60s.
Interesting. So, so I get leads me to my next question. So when and why were wigs adopted in courts of law?
Oh, I didn't really cover that because that's not fashion. It's terrible. No, it's not terrible. But it was a holdover. One of the images I was going to include, but I didn't, is an image of like these judges at the bench in like the mid 18th century, and they're still wearing the long full bottomed wigs, which were very unfashionable. But it sort of comes into the world of jurisprudence first because a lot of those 18th century wigs were kind of related to professions. Like if you had your wig tied back in a queue and in a bag, that was sort of reflective of a military profession. Like you needed to gather the hair because you were doing stuff, So I think that it became became the legal wig, and then it never changed. But I don't know why the Brits still wear that. They still wear it, right?
Yeah, they
I
do.
think they do. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry. I'm sorry I don't have an answer for that. Good question.
Yeah, no, it is a great question. So, and then also there's another question related to that. I heard that when people respected old age, it's for its wisdom. They wore powdered wigs to imply that they were also wise. Is this so?
I would say that could be an aspect, and I would say that 18th century culture didn't necessarily prioritize youth in the way that really fashion culture has from the 1960s on. So it just wasn't a priority, but it's also a great line. It's a great look. It's really kind of, it makes everything sort of monotone and beautiful. And it wasn't always white hair either. Like you could actually have color powders. So there would be like pinks and blues, but not like strong pink and blue, but like a sort of powdery pink and blue or green that you could put in your hair. So I think that it was certainly helpful if you were an older woman of fashion that any gray would be sort of powdered over. But I think that there were other reasons as well, not the least of which is when you get that big bouffant hair, they're literally like sticking it up and together with all of this like grease, like animal fat, essentially. And the helps make it like cake. It's like you're putting it together and you're sealing it. So the powder had a very sort of specific styling functionality. And so that is a part of it as well. I'd love to think that it was also about respect for our old elders, though. Someone is very gray now.
So for theatrical wigs, what is the largest storeroom of wigs for rent?
Oh, I don't know. That's a good question. I actually I found so much stuff about theatrical wigs like in my research, but I was like, no, I want to do fashion wigs, and theatrical wigs are amazing. Like when I was talking to Isaac, who I interviewed for the book, we talked about the wig room at Saturday Night Live, which is like A plus wig room. Like they're doing incredible wig work for that television show, like for many decades now. But I don't know in terms of like rental what that would be. I mean, there's wig stores all over, but I don't know about renting because that's, you know, renting hair is it's a tricky thing. I don't know the answer to that. Another one. I'm stumped. I'm stumped again. I
Oh, no,
apologize.
no worries. No, no. I think honestly, I would be kind of weirded out renting a wig, honestly. Because you don't know where it's a little.
Yeah, you definitely want to know their practices. You want to know their practices. That's
Yeah.
all.
Um, and can you discuss the powdering your wig, also at what the powders were made of?
Oh, very good question. So this one I know. So initially it was wheat powder. And as you may know, wheat is also a thing that people eat, especially like people who don't have food, like the poor in France. And so wheat powder was initially used, and then there were grain riots at Rouen in 1715 because they found out that rich people were putting wheat powder in their hair. So wheat powder was abandoned as a substance to use for powdering your hair. And I would say the most abundant thing used in the 18th century would have been a powder of plaster of Paris. So you would take sort of a plaster of Paris and grind it up, and that's also how they could add color elements. So yeah, and as ways to decorate yourself go in the 18th century, that is probably one of the less toxic ones. So yeah.
Okay, so and someone wanted to ask, where did the term big wigs come from?
Big wigs is very much a reference to those 17th century full bottomed wigs. So the big wig is Charles II. The big wig is Louis XIV when he embraced the wig, which he did when his hair started thinning when he was in his 30s, because he had also been, my hair's amazing, I don't need a wig, you know, but then he did. And so he embraced it. But those are the big wigs of wig talk.
Okay, so I guess what surprised you the most during your research?
I think probably the sort of brightly colored and insane wigs of the 1910s. I looked at that picture that I very briefly showed of the blue wig, and she's got the egret feathers, this incredible illustration. Um, it was the wig underneath forever. And then I was doing some research at Rijksmuseum, and I was like, oh, this is a wig. And then I got into like the New York Times account of the whole trend and how Lucille, Lady Duff Gordon at the House of Lucille was involved, and she was the first to present them in 1913. And she did these intense colors. And I think, you know, that into the 30s, the fancy dress wigs and how like proto club kid they were, how surreal they were, how like excessive they were. I mean, I just didn't think that started until the 60s. And so it was such a joy to be like, no, no, fashion's been on this.
Mhm. Yeah. I actually wanted to read a quote to your audience from your book, and it's from Michael Gordon of Bumble and Bumble. Captured one picture of almost magically long hair being styled with the words, "Portions of this picture might involve exaggeration and false notions of average hair types and quantities."
Yes. That quote, I believe, was very much from the let's call it the extensions era in the early 2000s, when everybody started to have this insanely long hair. And I think that, you know, you would see it on the runway and you would see it everywhere, and it was like, how are who are these girls with this insane long hair? Like, how do you, you know? And I think that it wasn't really acknowledged that a lot of that was extensions for a long time. I mean, I think that was another fun thing, was to sort of understand how crucial wigs and hair pieces were to creating the runway hair that I loved so much, and the incredible hair designers who do it. I mean, I didn't get to name check like Daniello, Sam McKnight, you know, or Reeve. I mean, Orlando Pita. Like, there's just some incredible hair designers who picked up the 60s where hairdressers started to become a name and took it even further in terms of creativity, I think, in the 90s and especially in the 2000s on.
Yeah. And what's next for you?
Next for me, I've been playing around with something more focused on like this idea of New York nightlife and like the club kid, that story like of nightclubs in New York. I think, you know, it's been something I've loved for a while. So I'm dabbling there, but I should be working on it more. I should be writing, right? Oh my God, I need to
You
get
should
on
wear a
that.
wig.
I know.
Well, I want to show everyone the book again, Wigging Out, Fake Hair That Made Real History. It's such a wonderful book. I love this book. I love all the pictures you chose. And I don't know how you chose how to decide which pictures you were to pick. I mean, you probably had a million to choose from, but these are exquisite. And I want to thank you, Jessica, for joining us. Please buy this book from a smaller retail store. I want to mention that. We're not going to mention the large retail stores. We want to support our local bookstores. And so I want to thank you, Jessica, for joining us. This has been a production of the National Arts Club. For more information, you can visit us at nationalartsclub.org or find us on Facebook, Instagram, X, and YouTube.
Thank you so much.